to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. I'm Professor Larry Jacobs, Director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance, the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Before we begin, I want to just give you a heads up that your participation is a big part of this conversation. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, right there, the red circle on the Q&A. That's your spot to give us good questions, challenging questions, topics that are not being addressed. Please give us your questions. We'll get to as many as possible. You'll also see down there, there's a button for a live transcript. If you'd like that, just click on it and you'll get that. Welcome and thank you for joining today's program, What's Next for American Democracy? We have a terrific panel and we'll have a lively conversation. We're joined today by Professor Theda Skocpol. She is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard University. Her research covers a number of topics, and she's been a leader in the fields of political science and sociology for a number of decades. Chloe Thurston is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University, where she researches American political development, race, political economy, and public policy. And we're joined by Keith Whittington, who is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He's published widely on American constitutional theory and development, federalism, judicial politics, and the presidency. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. Professor Skocpol, let me begin with you. Can you tell us a little bit about this report that we're going to be discussing today and that you'll be able to find in your link in a moment?
Thank you, Larry, and I'm pleased to be here with my fellow panelists and always pleased to be talking to my fellow citizens in the wonderful state of Minnesota, which I visit every time I can. The What's Next project was launched a year and a half ago, pulling together a small group of people, expanded eventually to about 18, mainly scholars who studied American politics in the current period and in the past in some cases, and are concerned about the challenges to democratic institutions, practices. Imperfect as they are in the United States, they seem to be facing the kinds of threats to undo long taken for granted mechanisms for enforcing government responsibility and honest elections, so that we may be in a period in the United States that's comparable to the kinds of threats that were faced during the period of Reconstruction, between Reconstruction and the turn of the 20th century. And what our group did, and you'll see reflected in the democracy piece if you're able to read it, is to say, well, instead of doing what analysts can do very well, which is to try to guess what will happen in the future, let's make some assumptions that this is a period of challenge, but we don't know how severe the challenges are. There may be ongoing whittling away at voter access and even accurate counting of election results. There may be ongoing partisan gridlock in the federal government and between the two major political parties pulling apart on more and more issues. There might be more severe challenges. Entire sets of states may find ways to actually reverse results of elections or subvert honest election administration, or there could be a kind of Armageddon, especially if a Republican Party that in this period includes a very large majority of office holders at the national level and in many states who do not appear to be committed to majoritarian democracy in any form, even modified majoritarian democracy, and who have been winking at violence and threats of violence in many different arenas, not just on January 6th at the start of the Biden presidency. So we tried to outline ways to think about these three possible scenarios that could unfold not just nationally, but in and across many states, and speculate about the kinds of ways in which citizens of all party persuasions who care about preserving Republican and Democratic institutions in the United States might be prepared to forestall the worst and respond if the most severe threats come to pass. And I'm just going to say a couple of things about that, because we laid out a lot of possible ideas for each of these three threat scenarios. And we meant to encourage broader discussion of the kind that I suspect is going to happen in today's forum. We focused, I would say, in two major areas. For the moderate ongoing threats, we think it's very important to re-energize citizens from the bottom up and groups from the bottom up in localities and states in ensuring fair and accurate elections. And my favorite idea, which I throw out in university settings all the time, is that if students want to organize to preserve American democracy, they might create groups of people prepared to go to the polls and do what election workers who are often frightened away by threats of violence are no longer able to do in many places. So if you're in a state or in a county in a state where there are threats that have discouraged election workers from volunteering, that's a very concrete thing that can be done. So we lay out a series of things like that could inspire action, not just by partisans, but across partisan lines. And then finally, for the most severe possibility, let's say 2024 arrives and either an accurately counted or a not so accurately counted election brings to power a Congress and a president who are not committed at all to the rule of law or to sustaining American democracy, who don't want to be thrown out of office. I won't name any names, who countenance violence, may even encourage it against those they perceive as domestic enemies. What then? I speak for myself here in saying that under that severe threat scenario, I don't think the kinds of responses that liberals and progressives have used over the last 5 decades are likely to be adequate. Obviously, appealing to the president is not going to do it. That's a favorite liberal tactic. And if you don't have a president to appeal to, that doesn't work. Going into the courts may not work, because the courts may be a long, winding road to denial of what may seem to many Americans like elementary steps to maintain fair representative government. And pouring into the streets in large numbers could actually create an occasion for an authoritarian-minded executive to invoke the Insurrection Act and even call out the military against protesting citizens. So my favorite ideas are that we should be laying the basis now for stronger alliances across states and communities that are committed, no matter what happens at the federal level, to sustaining democracy in their regions and in their jurisdictions. And we should start thinking now about the fact that the parts of the United States that are most economically vibrant, that have the largest number of income taxpayers, are the ones that may be disproportionately aligned with the pro-democracy coalition. and that they should think about finding ways to rework some fiscal practices that liberals have taken for granted for half a century, including the idea that the best way to promote democracy and equality is to send money to the federal government to redistribute as best it can to the least privileged regions and groups in the country. Perhaps we'll have to find a way to rethink those kinds of fiscal flows in the future. And if a protest action on a mass scale becomes necessary, withholding income taxes, if it's widely organized, is a much safer way to proceed than pouring into the streets in the face of armed authorities. So that's quite an idea to put on the table, but I'm going to put it on the table. And it's an example of not a conclusion that this group of 18 scholars came to, but a kind of brainstorming about alternative possibilities that might have to be thought through in this period.
Thank you very much, Professor Scotchpole. That's plenty to talk about for a long time. Let's just start with the overall analysis. Professor Whittington, I'd be curious on your reaction about how you assess the threat to American democracy and the severity of that threat and possible responses to what you see as a threat.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm a little short on responses, but I have to, and I think there's a lot of people thinking about it. I think we are sort of in brainstorming mode, as Theta suggested, and in part because I think the challenges in front of us are highly unusual. They put pressure on the system in ways that we really haven't seen before. And so the kinds of responses that might be necessary to them, I think, are not yet at all clear. And I think some of it's going to be contingent and contextual. And so it's hard, I think, to fully anticipate what all the responses are going to be. And I'm sure we'll get into the responses more. So let me set aside for now. But just say I am very deeply concerned about where we are and where we're likely to be headed as a democracy. And I worry both about anti-democratic forces, which is what the report tends to mostly focus on. I think those are very real, and there are real challenges ahead as a consequence of that. I think the report's probably right in saying that the biggest anti-democratic challenges are found in the current Republican Party and on the political right. So I think that's a real phenomenon and concern. I think the report has some useful suggestions about how to shore up some aspects of that. I think it is crucial that we be thinking very seriously about election administration. It's sort of a boring technical feature of our democracy, but critically important to how it actually works. And I think right now that's under particular threat. It's hard to actually count ballots quickly and accurately, as well as do so in a fair fashion. We're seeing a lot of pressure being put on that element of things. I'm somewhat less concerned about access to ballots and voters being able to go to polls than I am concerned about fair and accurate counting of ballots once they've occurred. And like I said, that's sort of a fairly dull kind of task, but I think it's a critically important one, one that's frequently ignored and needs to be shorn up. The other kind of concern that I have is really a little less about, although it overlaps with the anti-democratic forces, than I am with illiberalism. That I worry not only about threats to democracy, I also worry about threats to freedom. And democracy is a useful but imperfect mechanism to help achieve some of that. But I worry that part of what we're seeing now, and I think this is true on both the left and the right, is the rise of very serious illiberal forces in American politics, unlike anything we've seen for several decades. And that's extraordinarily discouraging. And I think it poses a different set of threats and different sets of challenges than some of the ones to democracy as such. And so I worry these two things are going to reinforce each other, and as well as create feedback loops of the sort that the report suggests. There's a real concern that perceived excesses on the other side will lead to a desire to try to crack down on those protest or dissenters or opponents in particularly scary ways. There's certainly clearly those around former President Trump who embrace some of those ideas as the path forward. I think the threat of illiberalism is quite severe, and thinking about sort of where its sources are and also how do you effectively push back is going to be quite important.
Professor Whittington, I want to just kind of explore that for a second with you. Fred Bauer, writing in the National Review, agreed that the trends were of real concern. He also said that he thought, and I'm quoting him, the friends of liberty might also remember that the politics of emergency often exert a grave cost to our institutions of government and to our personal well-being. A thirst for Rubicon crossing is at odds with democratic sustainability. Do you think that some of the warnings and the ways in which the warnings about the end or the threat to democracy might be intensifying the kind of partisan rancor, intolerance that we see?
I think it does. And, frankly, 6-7 years ago, I actually was very concerned about overreaction and sort of increasing cries of rising fascism and the like as giving rise to both excessive fears about where we were, but also can itself feed into a cycle in which everybody feels like they have permission to violate the established rules because the situation is so dire that we can't behave like we normally do. Traditional constitutional restrictions are no longer adequate, and so we have to try new forms of governance in ways that I think could be quite disturbing and counterproductive in the long term. I have to admit, though, over the last couple of years, I think some of those fears of dire circumstances are much more real. And as a consequence, I think one has to face up to that and try to grapple with it seriously. And so I think there is a worry about overreaction. I think it's important to think carefully about how you go about doing that. Because I think it's precisely true that if you justify sort of states of exception, states of emergency, that will create bad dynamics on its own. And so we have to be very cautious, I think, about what kinds of tools we're willing to reach for. But I think at the same time, we don't want to minimize or understate the threat that's out there and how we respond to it. I think one thing that's worth noting, though, and it feeds into the polarization, which is one of the things the report points to as well, is people have very different views about what the threats are. And this is part of our challenge at the moment. So we've had recent surveys, for example, where voters on both the left and the right think that democracy is under threat. They don't trust the other party and the other partisans to secure democracy and secure core American values moving forward. So a lot of people are looking at sort of similar things out in society and coming to very different conclusions about where the threats are. And that creates, I think, particular difficulties of how do you build then some kind of unified coalition that's going to be supportive of sustaining democracy and free institutions when there are such divisions over where the threats are actually coming from.
Thank you. Professor Thurston, there's been quite a bit of research suggesting that the rise of authoritarianism is a product of white resentment of people of color. And some of these, the research has pointed to growing support for instance, for a president who works on problems without paying attention to Congress or bends the rules to get things done. And that this is very much tied, at least in a kind of a correlation sense, to the rise of resentment against people of color. Do you think this story that we're talking about really centers on race? Is this a story about the development of our institutions and the ongoing conflict involving the racial divisions in America?
Thanks. I would be careful about sort of distilling it to a single narrative, any single cause, race as well. At the same time, I think that, Theta sort of raised this provocation initially that, are we in sort of a period of Reconstruction, or how should we think about the sort of history of race, of efforts to build the multiracial democracy, how these might sort of lead to periods of democratic backsliding, what the sort of different types of mobilizing responses are, et cetera. So, there is a through line in American history that does entail sort of periods of sort of inclusion, sort of racial inclusion in sort of democracy and democratic institutions, particularly political power, right? Actually gaining political power, holding office, and then white backlash to those advances. And we see this throughout history. The historian Carol Anderson has an excellent book that sort of distills a lot of other people's work on this, so that we can sort of see this, how this sort of happens over time. And there's plenty of evidence from political scientists today that if we want to think about the current resurgence of authoritarianism and authoritarian movements in the United States, we might start to date those back to the election of Barack Obama, sort of the first African-American president in the United States, and the rise of the Tea Party, and sort of the sort of white racial grievance that attended with that rise. And so in that way, I think that it is important to sort of think about the sort of that longer through line of these conflicts over multiracial democracy, the fact that political rights, especially voting rights, are unsettled, and they have been throughout history. We've never really had a sort of an expansion that hasn't also come along with efforts to restrict in different ways access to the ballot, or just sort of access to political representation more broadly. I don't think we should forget. At the same time, I think that, like I said, I'm a little concerned about overemphasizing one single aspect of these conflicts, because ultimately, if you take seriously the threats to American democracy that have been outlined in this report, that people sort of talk about daily, those require building coalitions that are going to bridge across many different divisions socially, including racial divisions, including sort of divisions over gender, religious divisions, what have you. And so I think that we need to think about ways to sort of not lose sight of that broader sort of set of historical facts and ongoing realities that also manages to think seriously through how the US builds this project. It's sort of, as Levitsky and Ziblatt, two political scientists, Veda's colleagues, say, like, there's really no choice in the United States but to have some sort of multiracial democracy. It can be more democratic, it can be more authoritarian, but this is just a reality of the United States political demographic situation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Theda, I want to ask you a pointed question, because your research over many years has been very much comparative. You think about the US, but often in the context of Europe and in some of your earlier research, Russia and Asia. Right-wing parties and authoritarianism is on the rise in Europe and elsewhere. But in the US and not there, we saw very fast, very dangerous movement that led to Donald Trump's takeover of the Republican Party, and then essentially an attempted coup. Why did that happen in the US?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, just to follow up on Chloe's excellent points, the good news is that we do have a broad multiracial citizenry that is now interested in having a vibrant democracy for all of us. The majority of Americans, and I would say this crosses partisan lines to some degree, are done with that kind of stuff that would have been a majority position in the 19th and early 20th century. But the bad news speaks to the question you've just asked, Larry, because American institutions and the American party system, as it interacts with our governing institutions, offer a lot of levers, as some of our colleagues have laid out, for obstruction of majority will, which over time, obstruction of majority will on questions like elementary gun safety, the right of people to make their medical decisions about their families, which is what I think abortion is about in a lot of people's minds. It's about who decides, not what they decide. You could name a whole series of other majority would like to deal with climate change and the energy transition that our country has to take. But we have powerful forces, and they're not just populist, they're also elite, who are perfecting the use of the levers built into American federalism, built into two-party competition in single-member districts, the possibilities for gerrymandering, the possibilities for capture and court review of decisions in a way that delays, if not undo many of those decisions. And so I would say that the fact that forces from above and below over the last 15 to 20 years have captured much of the Republican Party, and I don't mean all Republicans, so let me make that distinction, but many of the levers of elected office holding and party machinery on the Republican side and the groups around it for a project of minority authoritarianism, of trying to lock in the will of minorities. And some of those are elite minorities that want to prevent government from doing things in a redistributive way. Others are more popularly minded, fearful groups that want to impose their ideas about morality on others, and their fears, and act out their fears about immigration as well as race, I think, and gender change. All of these are happening at once. These forces have increasingly perfected how to use a combination of levers to obstruct and now increasingly to install minority dictates. And this is where I think I've moved with Keith. I thought this was overplayed for a while too, but I don't think it's overplayed anymore, because the embrace of threats of violence and actual use of violence is really not on the crazy left. It is on the crazy right. And so in this period, at least, we have to face the fact that there is an early 1930s style fascist combination coming together in this country that has to be defeated, not compromised with, because they're not in a mood to compromise.
I want to come back to that.
I study these folks. I talk with them. I know them. They're not in a mood to compromise.
I want to come back to you on your last comment about fascism, but Professor Whittington, the Constitution of the U.S. is cited for generations as a tool for ensuring and helping to create filters and protections for liberalism, for the idea of protections for minorities, freedom, and minorities, including landowners and religious minorities and so forth. Now we're seeing this interpretation of the Constitution more menacing, as being exploited by those who are anti-democratic and authoritarianism. Does that strike you as right? Are you tracking that? And
yeah, I guess I'm a little more skeptical of that per se. I mean, I think it's, and I'm less enthusiastic about some of the majoritarianism that I hear, and part of what Theta is hoping for. I'm still in favor of lots of checks and balances and limitations on what popular majorities can do. My concern, though, which is echoed in the report, is that Congress as a key policymaking body is clearly quite broken. And that makes it very difficult to develop common ground, to find compromises in order to fix and address genuine policy problems that people want addressed in various ways. I think they're not easy policies to address. And so things like immigration, for example, there's clearly a tremendous desire to do something, but lots of disagreement about what that something ought to look like. But we don't currently have a very good policy-making mechanism to try to channel those concerns into productive dialogue that can lead to some kind of durable policy shift. And that Congress really is fundamentally at the heart of that process. And so significant reform to how Congress goes about its business is going to be important. I think likewise, our political parties are broken in pretty fundamental ways for some of the reasons that the report points to as well, in part because it elevates up extremist voices that then have consequences, for example, for Congress and how the policymaking process works. And so I do think we need to be doing a lot of work in order to make these sort of key democratic institutions function better. So our democratic decision-making is more informed, more capable of finding some common ground and capable of building support. And I think these are mostly sub-constitutional concerns rather than features of our constitutional system as such. They are things that are fixable to some degree, at least, within the confines of the Constitution, but still not easily fixable. And some of them, I think, potentially require some pretty dramatic changes. And so if you're revisiting how party primaries work, for example, and how candidate selection occurs within political parties, that's potentially a quite dramatic set of transformations about how we've run our politics for nearly 100 years now. And yet I think some of that's necessary.
Thank you. And folks, please do give us questions. We're eager to get to them. Chloe Thurston, we've been talking about the decline, the threats to democracy. We haven't talked about resilience. And I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, after all, if you look at the last three elections, midterm and the presidential, we've seen voter turnout at very high levels that we haven't seen in decades and decades. Donald Trump was stopped from attempted coup. The Justice Department has prosecuted hundreds and hundreds of people for their role in the January 6th invasion of the Capitol and their brutalizing of the Capitol Police. The election administration system that Professor Whittington mentioned held despite incredible pressure. Isn't that a story about resilience? Shouldn't we be kind of talking about that?
Yeah, we should be. I think that these are extremely important developments, and they should leave us with some optimism, maybe not so much optimism that we lose any concern for things that can happen in the future. I will say after 2022, I was impressed with much of what you're pointing to, right? The fact that some of the most extreme candidates were repudiated at the ballot box. The fact that, now we, like you say, we've seen the prosecution of at least of folks who were involved in January 6th, both who were at the Capitol, but also the lawyers, right, have faced some repercussions, professional repercussions for their own role here. I guess I would point to, I actually want to go back to the optimism in a second, but I do want to also highlight a few issues that we should think about as well. And so, it's true that, voters seemed to not like that chaos and responded. And that seems like a very good sort of, as political scientists, this is kind of what we theorize, right? People, they sort of speak up when things bother them a lot. And so that sort of they may have repudiated some of the most extreme voices. At the same time, members of Congress who did not vote to certify the election still were reelected.
They run the Congress now.
They do. We see, and speaking of running the Congress, this sort of continuous threat now of a government shutdown. You could think about some of the longer term consequences of this, right? In terms of further eroding people's trust that the government works, that it can function, that we should be comfortable sort of leaving it to democracy, right? To sort of allow the government to perform its basic functions versus some other alternative, maybe a strongman. And then the most concerning set of developments, well, these are very short term, but I was very concerned to read about former President Trump's recent remarks, sort of highlighting specific interests, right? I mean, that's generally beyond the pale for mainstream political conversation, except that we've been experiencing this for years and years now. And so, that kind of discussion of eliminating internal threats is highly concerning, especially for a candidate who is very likely to become the major party nominee again, and for whom many voters are demonstrating support for. So there's that. I want to go right back to the resilience though, and then I'll stop because I know that this is a panel with multiple people. Because I think that there's one thing that the report could have said a little bit more about, and that I think we should all be thinking about, are sort of rather than thinking only of what has been lost or sort of where the threats are, what sort of elements of that are important to American democracy, American society have eroded in recent years, we should also be aware of and attuned to and appreciative of sort of our local institutions that have been resilient, in part because if we don't appreciate, participate, and sort of fortify those institutions, they're always at risk of also becoming sort of diminished. And so, I mean, I can think in my own town, we have schools, libraries are trusted intermediaries, providers of information. It tends to be considered nonpartisan. It's important to uphold this. Institutions like the Y, these are sort of opportunities for people to still meet and interact across sort of lines of class difference, racial difference, other forms of difference. And where local newspapers still exist, it's important to support them. This is a longstanding trend of local newspapers also succumbing to decline. There are many fewer sort of with the nationalization of politics more broadly. But again, I think when we're thinking about resilience, there's the sort of bottom-up building that needs to be done, as Theda has pointed out too, but there's also needs to be sort of an appreciation and fortification of these sites that still exist locally and still perform some of those functions.
Yeah, that's great. And for those who don't know, we started here at the Humphrey School, the largest online election administration training program. It's for graduates, it's for undergraduates. We have about 100 students in the program now. And the courses are taught, with the exception of me, by the top election people who are directors of elections in states and US Homeland Security and so forth. So if you'd like to check that out, it's called Certificate of Election Administration. It is the gearbox of our democracy. It is entirely nonpartisan. And these people are, I can say from working with them 15 years, absolutely remarkable. Professor Scotchpole, I want to just slightly shift gears to something you raised and has been raised by one of our friends here in the audience. And it really is about the danger of fascism in America. And you have studied kind of the politics of Europe and the radicalization. Is fascism the right term? Is this a stage that we may be heading towards, or maybe signs of? And how would you distinguish between kind of authoritarian minority elements that you were talking about versus what might be seen as a kind of qualitative shift to fascism?
Look, I'm not, as those who know me will understand, I'm not hung up on definitions. So I am open to other words. And I understand how dangerous it is to use that word because it brings to mind the genocide of the 1940s. And I don't think that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you go back and you read how German liberals thought about, or even conservatives who were committed to the constitutional order in Germany, thought about what was happening as it unfolded. or in places like Italy, or even other European countries, they couldn't quite believe what they were experiencing. And they thought that some of the figures that were espousing a kind of populist appeal to scapegoating, to finding the vermin, as Donald Trump just put it. That is a straight out fascist speech that he gave in the early 1930s sense. I mean it as a coming together of top down and bottom up forces that are willing to move beyond institutional procedures. And Professor Whittington should not imagine that I'm a pure majoritarian, or that I imagine that America ever has been or ever will be purely majoritarian. But when you have a combination of elites, party elites, business elites, religious elites, others who are prepared, university leaders who are prepared to sit by and blink as people who threaten violence and actually execute violence against, it usually starts with powerless minorities in an ethnic sense, or political groups that are seen as outgroups. That can very quickly overtake the kind of civil society and the kind of acceptance of losing and coming back to fight again in elections that liberal civil society and free speech, freedom to organize, the willingness to accept losses in elections, those are core things that can go away in a matter of months and years if these kinds of forces grab the levers of power and refuse to give them up, and turn to a combination of threats and carrots that others will acquiesce in, not thinking that it will lead to as extreme a set of outcomes as it could. And I just, since January 6th, and since the willingness of most of the Republican Party in Congress to go along with someone who strikes a lot of people as a joke, as a potential president again, let alone the first time. This is a real threat. Donald Trump could win the presidency again, and he could be backed up with a party that has already shown it's willing to go along with anything. And those who aren't are quitting that party or losing elections. So I think that's what I mean. And I don't care what we call it. Perhaps we can call it top-down, bottom-up authoritarianism, or the quest for minority rule by stretching American institutions beyond the breaking point. It's very real, because one major political party in a two-party system has been captured by this, at least for now. I don't believe forever, but I think for now. And so I see that as a profound threat.
Professor Whittington, you mentioned in your opening comments that your real concern was about illiberalism. Could you talk a little bit more about that and kind of some everyday instances of what you mean?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, so to take one kind of example, because I've been focused a lot on free speech issues, academic freedom issues over the last few years. And it's certainly one space in which there's been an extraordinary rise of unwillingness to accept or tolerate dissenting opinions, a desire to try to suppress them in various ways. Whether that comes also from sort of bottom up and top down in some of the ways that they just suggest is true about our politics more generally. There are, as we've seen now, a lot of legislative efforts and top down policy efforts to squelch dissenting views or unpopular views relative to those leaders in universities. And likewise, there's lots of pressure from the bottom up to try to shut down voices that are inconsistent with majority opinion on college campuses, for example. I don't think free speech is the only place we're seeing it, but it's certainly, I think, one sort of highly visible dimension of this kind of illiberal intolerance of those who disagree, a desire to not try to build bridges and find common ground and work through dialogue, but instead a desire to somehow try to disempower them and suppress them rather than try to work with them. We certainly have seen the rise now, and I think it is primarily in the Republican Party, although not exclusively in the Republican Party, a desire to use the levers of state power to try to take action against those who are seen as out of step with favored values or favored ideas, or somehow resistant to the political forces. They're taking control of governmental institutions. We've seen that across a variety of states, and certainly there are aggressive plans to mobilize federal power in the same kind of way, if it's possible to capture those tools as well. One of the bright spots that I've seen over the last several years has been the federal judiciary. I'm actually fairly enthusiastic about how it's responded to some of these things compared to a lot of other political institutions. I think there's more resistance to some of these kind of populist urges, more commitment to longer term principles. But I think there's real pressure across the board to try to sideline institutions like that, precisely because they complicate the process of policymaking. They get in the way of trying to impose what a party or emerging majorities might want to accomplish. And so, again, there's a real pressure to try to streamline decision-making to make it as easy as possible for, in some cases, one person to be able to make political decisions they want and not have to grapple with those who disagree with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been, as I'm sure you're following, criticism from the Trump camp of the Federalist Society. And one of the criticisms is basically they're too keen to follow the rule of law and not the dictates of Donald Trump. Is that the kind of thing that gives you hope about the federal judiciary, that you have a spectrum of judges, and those who are have been recommended by the Federalist Society are not necessarily in cahoots with Donald Trump and his allies?
They vary.
I think that's right. There's lots of variation out there. But, I think, for example, the federal courts performed pretty well during the 2020 election and the contestation of the election results after 2020. They certainly performed much better than some other members of the government and the elected features of our government. I don't know if I'm encouraged by the current reports coming out of Trump world about their desire to circumvent the Federal Society and build alternative institutions. I do see it, though, as a telling indication of what their ambitions are. I think they are correct in seeing that the Federal Society and the kinds of lawyers and judges that are attracted to it are not well aligned with what it is they want to try to accomplish. And they're building, I think, an entirely new set of institutions, and sometimes taking over some existing institutions, think tanks and lobbying organizations and the like, that are recaptured, repurposed with new ideological commitments and goals. And I find that quite frightening as sort of an indication of the extent to which new institutions are being captured and how radical the vision is as to how we ought to be moving forward, such that, for example, lots of traditional conservative commitments and institutions are no longer consistent with the game plan, and so as a consequence need to be sidelined, let alone various sort of liberal and progressive institutions and advocates as well, which, it goes without saying, want to be sidelined in this context. So it's worrisome about how it's developing. I think the one sort of positive thing I take out of that is how hard it will be to actually successfully build that kind of movement. Trumpists are really trying to build from the ground up a completely new set of personnel, new staff, new ideology in order to try to run the government if they were to succeed in winning election. And I think they're going to be hard pressed to actually be able to do that very successfully. And so the quality of what they wind up doing and how effective they're going to be, I think, is very much an open question, assuming they win elections.
I just want to stick on this topic for a moment because while we're here, we recently had a program on the efforts to disqualify Donald Trump under Section 3 of Article 14. And Ilya Soman, who's at George Mason, a constitutional scholar, I asked him point blank, I said, you know, if there was a state court that ruled to disqualify Donald Trump, would it get almost certainly overruled by the US Supreme Court with a 6-3 conservative majority? He paused and said, no, I don't think so. I think it'd be 50-50. I said, how do you get to 50-50? He said, I think it parallels what you're saying. He said there are a group of justices, including Gorsuch, who are concerned about this deviation from the rule of law and the Constitution, and they're quite resistant to the push among Donald Trump and his possible reelection. Does that seem to you at all possible that there could be a Supreme Court majority?
No.
Well, I know, Theda, you feel that way, but I think Professor
the
Whittington.
whole thing is a terrible idea. The whole idea of trying to prevent a candidate from being on the ballot is tailor-made to supercharge the right in this country. And anybody who thinks a few federal judges are going to stand in the way of that effectively, it won't even be a close election if that's the technique that's used to try to keep Donald Trump out of office. This is one where I think it's a liberal idea that's very bad.
Actually,
we can't blame this on the Federalist Society.
It's actually, it surprised me how diverse the voices are. I mean, Ilya Somin is a rock solid libertarian. I see that former judge Michael.
It's a very elite approach.
It is a very elite, but it's also, it follows a certain line of constitutional thinking. Professor Whittington, help us out here.
So yeah, I think so. I agree. I think the Section 3 idea is a bad idea in terms of how we deal with problems facing us. I agree. I think that it will, in fact, feed a reaction that would be very damaging to democracy. And so I am kind of hoping we do not go down this path, but I'm not confident that we won't. And precisely because I think it seems likely that some state court will find this a reasonable way of proceeding. If so, it will force the U.S. Supreme Court to weigh in one way or another. And I'm actually not sure how the U.S. Supreme Court would likely come down on this. Just as a constitutional interpretation matter, I think the issue is complicated and not entirely clear as to what the right answer is. Right. And I think it's entirely plausible that a majority of justices could be persuaded that Section 3 could be deployed in this situation. But that's not to say a majority of justices would think it's a good idea that we do it. And I think some might think, well, as an interpretive matter, that's a reasonable way to go. But in fact, the consequences would be so dire that they wouldn't be willing to sign off on it. So I think it's highly unpredictable as to where the Section 3 as a legal matter gets us. But I agree that I think as a political matter, it's a mistake to go down that road. I think it will make our situation worse rather than better.
Okay, I think we've had a very clear sounding of that. And thank you for the question. Chloe Thurston, we've got just a bunch of questions here. They're all excellent. A question from one of our viewers: what is the impact of social media and the polarized news sources on the situation we're talking about?
Yeah. So political scientists and communications scholars have tried to answer the social media question. And the effects of social media on sort of polarization are a little bit less clear or obvious than we might think. I think the sort of intuition is that this causes people to silo and to end up in these sort of, very selective, restrictive media diets that then expand. It sort of leads them to then become even more extreme. And the evidence there is kind of thin. I think when we're thinking about polarized news agencies, there's also a similar sort of issue here too. Remember, most people don't actually follow politics. They're not that interested in it. The people here who are tuning in, unless Professor Jacobs is like forcing you to do this as part of his class, are a very selective bunch, self-selecting bunch who is interested in these types of topics. And so polarized news agencies, obviously by definition, provide polarized news. Very selective views tend not to sort of report on things that might make the sort of other side or make their side look bad. Or, but a lot of people are also just not watching that, and so we have to think more broadly about what those potential effects might be. It's possible that sort of, you could think about Fox maybe, or just throwing this out there, maybe it has a sort of filtering effect where it helps to sort of shape a certain set of views or discourses, or the New York Times or what have you. And even though people aren't necessarily reading these or watching these outlets, it still indirectly sort of shapes their views. But the direct effect is not necessarily as strong as we think. That said, we could also think about the role that polarized news agencies are playing in some of the developments that the report outlines today. It does seem like having sort of siloed and less diverse news and media environments might make it more difficult to hold extremists accountable in Congress, or sort of on the campaign trail, because again, people are sort of members, elected officials themselves are sort of playing to certain media outlets, certain types of coverage. They're not that concerned about sort of broad coverage. And the voters, again, who are like the most interested and concerned are going to be the ones that are also tuning in to selective polarized news agencies. So again, in a broad scheme, sort of the political science literature kind of doesn't necessarily support the idea that social media is the cause of polarization, or that sort of polarized news media is the cause so much as something that goes along with, corresponds with polarization. But that's not to say that these aren't still contributing to some of these effects, or at least making it more difficult to sort of remoderate, right? To sort of pull back the sort of impact or the influence of extremists in political parties and what have you.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. Professor Whittington, I want to switch gears. One of the recommendations or responses to the third scenario in this report is the really, I think, very provocative suggestion that we ought to possibly rethink our federal fiscal arrangements. And of course, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the progressive movement was all about building just these sort of extractive mechanisms. Now we're in a polarized era in which the threat of authoritarianism is rising. And this report is coming out and saying, wait a second, what's going on here is that the blue states are disproportionately sending their taxes, and they're being used disproportionately by many red states. And maybe we ought to rethink that and create a new sort of fiscal structure in which there is tax reform, but it's a progressive tax reform. What do you think of this idea?
I have to admit, I have not thought enough about it. So it's a dramatic proposal. I'm not sure if it fixes problems that are very severe in the first place. It seems a little orthogonal to what I take to be some of the main concerns. I think in principle, I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of centralizing some of the fiscal approach to how we spend money and cut out some of these federal state partnerships about how we structure programs and engage in spending. Part of my concern about those is that they've been used as tools by the federal government to unduly influence what state policy looks like. And so if the federal government wants to make policy, I think trying to draw it all into the federal system and do it directly may be a more productive approach. I think if you do that, it's not obvious to me as well that that alters dramatically where the money's going to go. It's still the case, for example, that states like Mississippi have a lot of poor people in them. And if you have anti-poverty programs at the federal level, money's still going to be wind up going to places like Mississippi, although you can bypass the Mississippi government as you distribute it if you were to redesign some of these systems as a whole. So yeah, I don't think I'm opposed to it. I'm not, but like I said, I'm not sure it addresses key problems in the current system.
So you're kind of intrigued that you'd have a group of mostly progressives proposing a conservative solution that's been around for years about
Oh,
rolling.
wait a minute. I don't think you understand what I'm talking about here. I am most definitely not talking about enhancing the federal government's ability to tell individual states what to do. How would that solve an authoritarian takeover? That would make it worse.
That's the question, I think. being asked.
What it's pointing to is something that we ought to keep in mind across the entire world. The current wave of whatever you want to call it, I think I prefer the term ethnocentric authoritarian movements, which have top-down and bottom-up components to them, are disproportionately popularly based in the least economically vibrant regions and the least internationally connected regions of their respective societies. I would defend that statement for Asia, Europe, Middle East, Israel, for example, before the current situation. So the question is, in the United States, particularly acute, because if you take a look at regional redistribution of tax resources, what you're going to see is that the taxpayers of California, New York, Massachusetts, Minnesota, various other states, and there certainly are some conservative ones in the mix, but they're disproportionately likely to be across partisan lines committed to the idea of a liberal civil society and at least partially democratic elections. They're sending their tax resources to a federal government that is subsidizing. And let's talk about Mississippi. That welfare money went to Brett Favre's daughter's soccer thing. Mississippi is a profoundly corrupt state. It's not the only one, but it takes federal money and diverts it to whites and to the less needy to an incredible degree. The amount that trickles down to the poor blacks in that state. They don't have Medicaid expansion. They don't have decent welfare policies. They don't have decent educational funds. The city they control the most has been taken over lock, stock, and barrel by a Republican legislature. I think we have to deal with realities here. And I'm just saying that if you get to the worst case scenario, you have to think, where are the levers of power? And the levers of power are not going to be people pouring in the streets to get gunned down. And they're not going to just be legal cases. You have to find other levels.
I mean, if this is the doomsday scenario that you're talking about,
but we could be there. I'm not saying we could be.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but if we were in the doomsday scenario, then what is the likelihood that those levers of power would be available in the first place? Wouldn't it be also sort of ideal for federal policymakers who are not coming from these sort of states that you're kind of portraying as the maker states, right? To try to hold on to those revenues and redirect them to their own populations. And if that's the case, then that kind of plan that you're talking about would be something that would need to be put in place now, or sort of.
Well, that's the whole point. I want people to think about it now.
Yeah.
And it's not a plan. It's a pointing to where the levers are. I actually think a fair amount of this is already going on. I think we are seeing regional compacts of states that are trying to create both the legal frameworks and the resource frameworks to deal with environmental issues that the country as a whole has not dealt with. So that's an example that I believe is already going on. And let's say we got to the worst case scenario. All I'm in favor of is thinking through what you do if you get to that. And I think it would be better to have an income tax strike than it would be to have massive demonstrations in the streets. And I don't think people even think about this because liberals are very caught in a groove. The groove they're caught in is send a lot of money to the federal government and count on it to pay for the people in Mississippi. I don't think that's working. I already think it's not working. And it really wouldn't be a very sensible way to proceed if an electoral college, but not popular majority of states that wanted to impose policies on the rest of us were in charge. And I do think that's the project. I'm not saying I think it's going to succeed, but it's a lot closer than I would have ever imagined to succeeding.
You muted there.
This is an excellent point for further thought, and I appreciate the topic being put on the table. I think there have been good questions raised as well. I want to get to a question that's raised by one of our folks who are watching, Tom Fisher, who's a well-known, highly respected administrator and scholar here at the University of Minnesota. He asked, how much is the erosion of support for democracy the product of global capitalism's growing power?
I think it's a contributor. And by the way, I think social media is too. I don't think that's the same thing as polarized news sources. I think the rise of the idea that you can declare your personal opinion in 40 characters has contributed to the rise of moral absolutism that erodes tolerance for dissenting views, which is a very severe threat from the left and the right. I think global capitalism is part of the problem. We certainly, I don't believe that the Tea Party, for example, was caused by economic factors directly, but I think it contributes to the differentiation of regional fortunes and the kind of sense of decay outside of metropolitan America that leaves many ordinary Americans open to scapegoating politics and to someone like Donald Trump who says, I'm on your side, I understand your problems. And I think we underestimate a lot of times how much politics for ordinary citizens is a matter of a fleeting impression of who's on your side and who they're angry at. I think that kind of context of winners and losers, particularly as it plays out regionally, is a big driver of a fertile ground for authoritarian populist politicians.
Professor Whittington, you talked about political parties in your opening comments, and you kind of look at other democracies. Let's look at Europe, for instance. Political parties play a central role in filtering out demagogues. Not so in America. The primary elections has become kind of a turnstile for who can turn out their supporters. They tend to be small in number and extremist and ideological in character. Is that kind of a critical institutional weakness in the American system?
I think it is. I think it's been demonstrated to be so, certainly over the last couple of decades. Both and two, I think, senses that I think about particularly. One is about candidate selection, and so parties have functionally outsourced candidate selection to a primary system. It makes them very vulnerable to the kind of rise of these populist candidates, outsider candidates, who can mobilize support in order to capture a primary election, and as a consequence, pretty easily take over a political party. We've seen it most visibly with Donald Trump, but we've seen it in lots of other lower profile candidates as well, who are capable of sort of entering into the political system really as sort of a pure outsider strategy, often quite hostile even to what the concerns and interests and values are of the underlying party, and nonetheless use it as a vehicle for moving forward. So I think probably some fundamental reconceptualization of how we go about the process of candidate selection and winnowing is probably critical. The other thing is we've hollowed out parties as funders of campaigns. And so it's also the case that parties have lost one of the crucial tools that they traditionally had, of how you pull back candidates, how you try to control politicians to some degree, which is they were crucial resources for mobilizing for elections. That's just not true anymore. Instead, candidates are quite capable of mobilizing support and resources outside the party structure entirely. They're much more free agents than in that context. And I think it has consequences facilitating some pretty extremist candidates who aren't under the kind of pressure for broad coalition building and long-term durability that political parties are essentially concerned with. So I think there are sort of long-term questions about how we organize parties and what the organizational structure of parties are going to be that have some consequences as to what we're observing in terms of how politics is playing out. Just one more brief point, though, that I think connects up to something that came up in the last conversation as well, that we're seeing not only in the United States, but in lots of other places as well, as they have characterized it, right, this real split in economic prospects in different parts of the country. One of the things I've been really struck by in our recent politics is there seems to be very little interest in expanding the size of our existing party coalitions, and a lot of interest then in how do we mobilize the people who are already in our favor, and how do we demobilize the people on the other side. I keep waiting for some party to figure out how to add to their coalition so you get a larger, more stable majority. May not be one I'm terribly favorable to in terms of lots of policy outcomes. But I think until we see that, we're going to have a really problematic dynamic. And so I think part of the challenge is how do you build some kind of electoral coalition that's going to connect up some of these people in these more economically depressed areas with the kind of people in these more economically vibrant areas into a common coalition with some common concerns and candidates behind
In a
them.
number of key states, the Democrats are already doing this. These processes are not entirely symmetrical. There have been real developments in Kentucky, in Wisconsin, in Georgia. I would argue in parts of the Southwest to build what I call a be there coalition. Instead of arrive there and tell them what to do at the last minute, be there, build linkages. E.J. Dion just sent me something that indicated that the Kentucky coalition involved Bashir building a stronger presence in the medium-sized cities of the state, which are a site of a lot of decline and decay and resentment in many states. And that same process happened in Georgia. The coalition in Georgia bridged beyond Atlanta into the 7 medium-sized cities in the southern part of the state. So I think this is happening. It's uneven. And I do not agree that extremists are anywhere near as much the tail wagging the dog on the Democratic side as they are on the Republican side. Otherwise, we would not have Joe Biden and we would not have the infrastructure bill.
Chloe Thurston, do you have thoughts about this kind of signs of a broadening coalition on the Democratic side?
Well, I want to highlight the which we haven't talked that much about until right now, the importance of state parties and party building. Of course, this is when we think about bottom up, we're actually also talking about sort of, what's happening at the state level, which nobody ever pays attention to. It's just sort of in some ways, it's one of the least visible arenas of political power, and yet it's extremely important.
Key. Yeah.
Key. And the sort of, I don't think it's a stereotype. I think it's actually was correct, was the sort of the Democratic Party had been sort of characterized as they pointed out, as just kind of showing up around election time in states, especially sort of battleground states, and sort of not having very much of a relationship with potential voting constituencies. And that does seem to be changing slowly in some areas. Which is interesting, although I'm still also kind of scratching my head about the interest in expanding coalitions. Where I've seen some inroads is on the right, expanding into sort of support with minorities. And, I think 25% of voters of color voted for Trump, and that was an increase from Obama. And this is in 2020, and also an increase from 2016, without overstating this sort of, as a trend of that, soon every voter of color will, be on the right. 25% is actually a pretty big number for a party that has struggled to make any sort of inroads, and that sort of raises questions about what type of multiracial coalition that party sees itself as building, particularly if those on the left, or those who see themselves as a pro-democracy sort of coalition, should actually maybe ask and try to understand why sort of some coalitional partners that are taken for granted as automatically being part of that coalition might also find themselves comfortable in this other coalition. And so I think that that's actually an area of party building and expanding that we should be aware of and thinking about and trying to understand empirically. Again, not just with voters, but also with the running of candidates of color as well.
Yeah, excellent point there. Actually, some of the findings in the New York Times Siena poll showed that the erosion among voters of color in terms of their support for Joe Biden was even more dramatic. Now, I don't know how much weight you want to put on one poll, but it was a significant finding. Theta Scotch-Poll, big debates been going on for a number of years about where Democrats and folks supporting democracy should put their time and effort. And there's one group that tends to focus on suburbs and urban areas, saying this is where the lion's share of our voters are. There's another group saying that the parties, and particularly the Democratic Party, has forgotten about urban, suburban, and rural voters in particular, and that those rural voters really have no choice. Do you have a view about that? Should Democrats be investing in a smaller number and perhaps more hostile rural areas?
Well, I've looked at the state of Pennsylvania in some detail. And by the way, not just at polls and individual vote counts, which I do not think are the core thing that political scientists should look at if they want to understand how things are going to unfold all over time. I think they need to look at kind of sustained organized presences and networks that are connected to institutions where people work and live their lives, like churches, for example. But there's just no question that the difference between Hillary Clinton and Biden, if we can just look at the presidential level, and it's even more true when we get to Senate and governors races, is losing by a less overwhelming margin in small town areas. I don't think there are very many true rural areas in America. So there really are medium-sized city areas and smaller town areas. And to the degree that Democrats are concentrated in big cities, the inner suburbs, and college towns, they're going to lose, given the way electoral districts are drawn in the United States. And I think that Joe Biden, for all that everybody is negative about him, at least he went around and visited the areas of Pennsylvania. And did it pay off? It did, in the sense that he lost a little less badly than Hillary Clinton did. And that adds up when you're adding up 67 counties, or let's say 60, compared to the 7 other ones that are going to go solidly Democratic. So I do think that being everywhere, running people, having local organized presence, potlucks, somebody to just be in touch with, somebody to put a face on Democrats that is other than that annoying professor on TV telling you why you're racist, or the people from the cities. You have to do that, and I do think Democrats are gradually learning that lesson and beginning to do more of it. But let's face it, for Democrats, more than for Republicans, this is an existential requirement. Democrats have to build cross-place coalitions and cross-district coalitions more than the current iteration of the Republican Party does. The Republican Party has certain advantages from the Electoral College and from the gerrymandering that state legislatures are now able to do without limit. Thank you, Supreme Court. That is directly due to the Supreme Court. I was sitting there the day that case was argued in the Supreme Court and saw the smirks on the faces of Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh when they made fun of the North Carolina advocates who were saying maybe we shouldn't gerrymander the state so badly that a 50-50 state can go 13-10 against one party. So basically, Democrats have got to reach out even more than Republicans do in this era. And I think they're beginning to try that in some key states. You're muted, Larry.
I know. Professor Whittington, I've got a question here about how should we be thinking about democracy? Because that word's we've been using it all for all our time together. And, obviously there's a kind of respond to all the people, majoritarian definition, but there are many other conceptions of democracy. How do you think about democracy, and what strikes you as kind of the right approach in terms of strengthening the political process in America?
So that's a good question. And trying to think about as well how to connect that up to what we mostly have been talking about in this context. I tend to think about one of the crucial features of democracy in general, right, is to create mechanisms of governmental responsiveness to citizens' needs and demands, and a focus and reliance on being able to build and persuade large groups of people to common policy solutions and how to run the government. The very heart of a democracy is a commitment to the idea that we're not going to use force to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. We're going to persuade and mobilize in order to try to accomplish what we want to accomplish. And part of what I find very concerning about some of the political forces that we've currently unleashed is the desire precisely to short circuit that. To want to find ways of not having to build bridges, of not having to build coalitions, not having to persuade people, but instead simply cut people out of the process. So I think that plays out across a wide range of institutions, not only in terms of how the government actually operates, but also down to thinking about the kinds of things they had just suggested about how do you build up an electoral coalition and make connections to pull people together into a common set of commitments and behind a coherent set of candidates. So yeah, like I said, I'm not sure that's very satisfying. I'm not sure how far it progresses in this particular conversation as well, but there it is.
Chloe, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, sure. I think that I like Keith's definition. I think I kind of agree with it. Also, maybe not the most satisfying, but sorry. I do think that sort of respect for the rules of the game, among citizens and among candidates and other sort of, people interacting in different capacities in the political system is also, key to how we should think about democracy. Sort of the discouragement of settling scores by force or violence. Again, I think that was encapsulated in Keith's definition as well. And the thing that I never really thought that I needed to say was about the sort of respecting loss, right? And accepting loss and sort of moving on. And, a system where sort of participants recognize that if they lost in one contest, they're sort of able to try again later, right? And that it's legitimate to lose. It's important to accept that loss. And there's this expectation of being able to compete in the future. That always seemed like so obvious that it didn't really need to get said. And yet in recent years, it's become sort of one of the the clearest indicators of democratic decline in the United States.
Professor Scotchpole, you've been studying kind of conservative grassroots movements and developments in the Republican Party. And we've got several questions here asking about whether evangelical Christian right has become a growing force in terms of the authoritarian turn of the Republican Party. Do you see that as a change over the time that you've been studying these grassroots conservative movements?
You know, it's a very good question. And I want to say that I think one thing political scientists have not done well is to study religious factors in politics. I have been thinking over the last year with a couple of my students about Christian nationalism and how to understand it. And there is a certain amount of good research done by attitudes, by survey research oriented people, which I don't think is enough. You won't be surprised to hear, but I think it's good. And one of the things it underlines is that not all conservative Protestant evangelical whites are also Christian nationalists. There is an outlook that can be boiled down to certain kinds of attitudes that is really more a fusion of authoritarian nationalist ideas about the myths about the identity of America, that it was always run by Bible thumping Christians, which is it's just a joke. If you go back and read the founding, so many of them were deists. But in any event, you know, these kinds of reconstructions of history are about inspiring movements in the present. They're not about getting an A in a history seminar. So the rise of a kind of a fusion of a certain kind of Christian theology with the worship of power, of national power in an exclusive and patriarchal form is definitely there. And I think much more research needs to be done, because I suspect it goes right down to the level of particular preachers and preachers networks and congregations, which are not all the congregations that look theologically similar. I mean, comparative historical research on religion and politics has long found that exactly the same theological outlook can be tied to very different political movements. Look at Mary Fulbrook's work comparing Protestantism in England and Prussia during the development of the West. So I think we need to know more, but I think this kind of a rise of a fusion of power worship, of willingness to accept Donald Trump as divinely installed. That belief is quite real. I individually know people who believe that in my network of people that I talk to, with a sense of Christian belief, of certain reading of Protestant Christian belief, is extremely dangerous, because it gives rise to the idea, which the current Speaker of the House espouses, that there is a God-given mission to impose a certain understanding of America on all of America. That is how authoritarianism comes to America. By the way, it's fatal to Christianity. And I say this as a Methodist. We know historically that when you fuse political power with any kind of theological orthodoxy, it slowly kills the religious side. The reason they separated church and state is because they knew it was bad for religion, not just bad for politics, to fuse the two. But we've got that now, and it's a real threat.
Thank you very much. We have rocketed through our time together. So I want to thank this terrific panel. We've had just a great conversation. Professor Keith Whittington, Princeton, Chloe Thurston, Northwestern, and Professor Theda Scotchpole, Harvard. This has been terrific. Thank you very much. Before you all depart, I just want to give a quick shout out We have a great program tomorrow as well on unionization. Unions, of course, are coming off some big wins, yet the share of workers represented by unions has declined. Why is that happening? We've got a great panel, a lot of different perspectives, and that's going to be moderated by my colleague in the history department, Will Jones. That's tomorrow. That'll be at noon Central Time. So check that out. Also, I want to let you know this program is available in a day or two. It'll be available as a podcast and also on YouTube. So you can get that. Please share it widely. And if you've liked this kind of conversation, please consider making a donation. We are getting to the end of the year phase, and all of our programs are free and open to the public, and we rely on donations to make that possible. Once again, let me thank this panel, Professor Whittington, Professor Thurstrom, and Professor Theda Scotchbolt. Thank you very much, and all of you have a great day.